Mama,
This old Africa, for so many millenniums, lay there, undiscovered in the full sun. One has a feeling here, as if one were almost in at the act of Genesis, where out of chaos and old night the land began to emerge from the waters. And I'm looking out at a rock where the land is still fighting as if the process of creation were not complete. And the land still has to raise itself above the level of the waters. This was the frontier where the strange, formidable, elongated Cape of Good Hope drives a wedge between two of the greatest oceans on earth, the South Atlantic and the Indian Ocean. This was the frontier of the first man of Africa, the Bushman, whose story is the oldest human story to which we still have access today. The Bushman was already a product of a vast and ancient Stone Age culture. How old and how long this culture had been committed to this part of Africa, it's impossible to say. We know only that vast sections of it belong to the Bushmen, and the Bushmen alone. This land stretches away with increasing orchestration from behind me, right up to the Mediterranean. And as it stretches away and flies almost to the north, it broadens out into a vast scale of land of all kinds. In the center is a raised plateau, cleft by deep valleys, piled high with mountains, traversed by streams and blessed with fountains, and then descending slowly into an immense tract of desert. Whether in forest, in desert, or on open plain, it contains the most diverse and abundant forms of animal life ever seen on Earth. There were, for instance, to be found no less than 130 different kinds of antelope, so that this first man had no difficulty in finding abundant sources of food, not only to feed himself and enable him to survive, but to give him the leisure, the tranquility, and the utter sense of belonging to create one of the most unique forms of Stone Age culture. And the inspiration of this culture stemmed directly from his own special relationship with his environment. He committed himself to nature as a fish to the sea, and this nature of Africa was kinder to him by far than our own civilization has been. He was a small man, not much more than 5 feet in height. His face was unlike the face of any other people in Africa, because he tended to have high cheekbones, slanted eyes, and a singularly oval face. And he made so startling an impression on my ancestors that they were convinced he was of Mongolian origin. And around his fires at night, with the lines roaring off stage, and the ostriches booming, and the wonderful night sounds of Africa making music to his conversation, he told the most profound and complex stories that illuminate even the psychology of today. And then he danced at night, and he made music at night, and by day, whenever he had leisure, he loved to paint the rocks of Africa. As a result, when my ancestors landed at the Cape of Good Hope more than 300 years ago, the land of southern Africa for thousands of miles into the interior glowed like an art gallery in the sun. Wherever the Bushman throughout his history found rocks smooth enough to be his canvas, he painted not only his everyday scene, but also his finest intimations of reality and the meaning of life, as no primitive men before him have ever done. In every way he was a beautifully proportioned and shaped person, but he had a behind which was most peculiar. In a good season, this behind grew large and filled out with fat, and stuck out well behind him. And this, of course, is a phenomenon which scientists refer to as steatopygia. This, to me, is of immense significance, because it suggests that the Bushmen had been in Africa since the beginning, for the hump is the authentic seal that nature put on people and all forms of life of Africa. We see it in the slight hump of the eland and the kudu, which gives them both a supply of fat and carbohydrates against lean and hungry seasons. I'm standing here in the mountains of northern Natal against one of the most important of all the Bushman subjects in art, at the beginning of a great frieze of eland. The eland is an antelope, not only the biggest of all the antelope in Africa, but it is the one animal which seems to have most universally had the greatest meaning for the Bushmen. The eland, of course, was enormously important as a source of food. But it seems to me, as this painting demonstrates, to have been even more important as a source of food for the imagination and spirit of the painter. It starts here with an extremely lovely painting of a female eland, an eland cow, looking nostalgically backwards. And it's remarkable because the paint is still so fresh. This is not a very well protected piece of rock, and yet it still has a glow upon it of the original. It's not been so faded. And then from there we move forward and we see the eland in all the phases of its life. And we see it as an eland leading a life of its own. We see it looking for food. We see it resting. We see it in little family groups, almost licking one another with affection. And then we see it as the hunted, as the pursued, but gradually acquiring an importance which one feels is more than an importance in the here and now, in an outsize eland, an eland of supernormal proportions, done deliberately by an inner compulsion of the artist, so that the sheer physical size of what he's doing can express the massive accumulation of meaning which this animal was acquiring in the spirit of Bushmen everywhere in southern Africa where they had contact with the eland. Now, we shall come back to the importance of the eland again in painting. We shall have to go back to it in the stories that the Bushmen told, because over and over again there are references in painting and in the stories which make clear that this animal, in a sense, was the Bushman's link, greatest and most fruitful link between the Bushman and his sense of the divine. I'm looking at what is left of what was once a great painting. We see a group of eland moving across the face of the rock, and then almost at one with the eland there rise two fantastic figures of what are authentic Bushman shapes and yet are transcendent humans' shapes. I have never seen Bushmen quite of this degree of stature. The Bushman tended always to walk tall in his art and to walk tall in his painting, as if it was not only compensation for his smallness of stature, but it was this an expression of this fantastic sense of meaning which he found in his natural environment. And he soars up there as if our imaginations take us over onto a non-human plane, and its impact is one of super being, of transcendence, of transfiguration of the earthly scene into something Olympian, if not utterly divine. But alas, old and ancient and secure as it seemed, he was already doomed. He watched, unafraid, quite calmly, the sails of the first ships and squadrons of the coming European masters of this continent sail by. And he even painted them on the rocks of the interior, seemingly without any intuition of the doom which this coming foretold for him and his culture. There are also rocks on which we see the invaders' wagons, and we see the invaders themselves in their prim calico dresses. And the Europeans had barely landed in the Cape in 1652, when immediately they began to clash with this ancient man. I believe they clashed because they belonged to two different divides in the human spirit. One divide which we represent, which is what I call a Jacob divide, a divide of people who had a very highly developed sense of property, who were very sophisticated, who cultivated the earth, who tended to build cities, who had a very advanced technology, and who despised anybody who had any other principle of living. But the Bushman was still committed to an Esau principle, to the first principle of life, where he was more interested in being than having. And he regarded the European and his cattle and sheep and other possessions as part of nature, and saw no reason whatsoever why he shouldn't help himself to them. And from that moment, a war to death broke out between the two. This process had already started centuries before, much further north, perhaps 2,000 miles further north, as a black tide of foreign people pushed further south. They too had a highly developed sense of property. They too could not forgive the Bushmen for raiding their cattle. And from the start, it was a war without mercy. It was a war to death. Over the centuries that followed, the white man and the black man between them eliminated the Bushmen in vast areas of Africa. It's fascinating to see how the rock paintings record the clash. First of all, between the blacks and the Bushmen. There are rocks thickly covered with the flying arrows and spears of the conflict. And suddenly we see redcoats appear, and the ancient art of painting vanishes from the land. And my mind goes back very much to a story told to me by my grandfather, who took part in one of the last raids against the Bushmen in the plains of the Orange Free State, because he not only painted in these mountains, he painted and he hunted in the plains as well. And there, in order to survive, he had started raiding cattle. There was no game left. And on this raid, everybody was exterminated. My grandfather says that when they walked among the Bushman bodies, there was one crumpled warrior who still had some arrows left in the band which they wore around their heads, and into which they stuck the arrows for convenience, so that they could just pull them out quickly and fit them to the bow and shoot. And you can see Bushmen decorated like that. It looks almost as if they have a crown round their heads. And there this body was lying, and then my grandfather noticed something else about him. He noticed that he had a leather satchel round his middle, and there were some strange things attached to the satchel. So he turned over to the body, and he saw, if I remember rightly, a dozen tiny little steenbok horns attached to the girdle, and in each one of these there was a different type of paint and pigment. And this was the last painter killed on active service with his people in the hills of the southern Free State. From early childhood I grew up saddened by the thought that never again would we see this unique man who had once roamed so freely throughout the whole of southern Africa. I thought he had vanished forever from reality. But happily this was not yet the end of the story. I discovered that there was still a coherent group of this great Bushman people left in the vastness of the Kalahari Desert. And this story for me has the most disturbing implications. It illustrates something in ourselves, something that is profoundly wrong with our civilizations, with which we have not yet made our peace, something which we do not yet understand in ourselves. So the story is a kind of mirror in which we, both black and white, can and must look and see how, when we had this vulnerable, this innocent, this lovable Stone Age man in our power, we behaved with equal ruthlessness, and we were both corrupted, absolutely corrupted, by our own power.